Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The Motorola radio crackled 3 times before Emily's voice cut through the static, and Christopher Brennan knew immediately that something had fractured in the world. Not from her words. Those came seconds later, strangled and wrong. But from the quality of silence between the bursts of white noise. In his 8 years patrolling Olympic National Park's backcountry, Chris had developed an unwanted sensitivity to such moments, a tightening behind his sternum that preceded disaster the way barometric pressure preceded storms. Chris, Emily's transmission broke apart, reformed. Trail marker 14, West Fork, there's something. More static. Then her voice dropped to a whisper that shouldn't have carried over radio frequencies. It's watching me. It looks like, oh God, it looks like Mr. Kovac. Chris was already moving toward his truck parked outside the Ho Ranger station when the transmission dissolved into a sound he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Emily screaming. Not in terror exactly, but in profound wrongness, as though her vocal cords had been designed for an entirely different emotion than anything human language encompassed. Then nothing. Just the rain, constant and indifferent, drumming against the station's metal roof. Emily, respond. Emily, this is Ranger Brennan, please respond. He tried 3 more times while pulling on his pack, checking his Garmin eTrex GPS unit, the screen showing the familiar green topography of the Ho River Trail corridor. Trail marker 14 would put her roughly 8.3 miles in, elevation 1,240 feet, where the main path split toward the Bogachiel drainage. Emily, confirm your position. The radio offered only static. Station Chief Garza emerged from the office, coffee mug steaming. What's wrong? Emily's in trouble. Last transmission from marker 14 mentioned someone named Kovac. Chris was already halfway to the door, but Garza's expression stopped him. A flicker of something that might have been recognition. Kovac? You sure she said Kovac? Yes. Mean something to you? Garza set down his mug with excessive care. There was a Stanislav Kovac. Died in 1994, logging accident up in the Bogachiel watershed. Before your time. He paused, weighing words. Strange circumstances. They found him 3 days after he went missing, but the body, medical examiner, had questions. Improper burial, apparently. Family wanted him shipped back to Romania, but there were complications. Chris felt that familiar tightening again, a phantom hand pressing against his ribs. He'd learned to ignore this sensation, had spent years rationalizing it as anxiety or intuition or pattern recognition. Anything but what his grandmother had called it in her Czech-accented English before she died. Vnímání, perception, the ability to sense ruptures in the natural order. What kind of complications? The kind we don't talk about during business hours. Garza grabbed a second radio. I'm calling SAR. You wait for... She might not have time. Chris was already pushing through the door into the rain. October in the Ho rainforest meant precipitation, measured not in inches but in weight, a constant atmospheric pressure that made breathing feel like drowning in slow motion. The moss-draped Sitka spruces surrounding the parking lot seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a ceiling that blocked out what little daylight penetrated the cloud cover. Brennan, that's in order. But Chris was in his truck, engine turning over, gravel spraying as he pulled onto the upper Ho road. The rational part of his mind knew Garza was right, that protocol demanded he wait for the search and rescue team. The other part, the part he'd spent his adult life trying to suppress, understood with absolute certainty that Emily Vasquez had approximately 4 hours of life remaining, and that the thing wearing Stanislav Kovac's appearance was patient in ways that erosion was patient. The trailhead parking area was empty except for Emily's Honda Civic, water streaming down its windows. Chris checked his watch. 2:47 p.m. She'd signed in at 9:15 a.m., planning a routine survey of the trail maintenance markers up to the 17-mile camp. Solo patrol, standard procedure, nothing that should have resulted in a transmission like the one still echoing in his skull. He shouldered his pack: Garmin GPS, Motorola radio, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, water purification tablets, headlamp, and the small leather pouch his grandmother had given him before she died. He'd never opened it, had told himself he kept it for sentimental reasons, but his fingers found it now in the pack's outer pocket, and it was warm. The Hoh River Trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained path through old-growth forest where the massive trunks of western red cedars and Sitka spruces created a colonnade of living wood. Moss covered everything in shades of green that had no names, draping from branches in translucent curtains, carpeting the forest floor in undulating layers. The air tasted of decay and growth occurring simultaneously, that peculiar alchemy of the temperate rainforest where death and life were indistinguishable. Chris moved quickly, his boots finding purchase on the muddy trail through muscle memory. The rain intensified, shifting from drizzle to downpour, and visibility contracted to about 30 feet. He passed marker 3 at 3:04 p.m., marker 7 at 3:38 p.m. The GPS showed his progress as a thin blue line across the green topography, reassuringly digital and precise. It was near marker 9, just past the first major creek crossing, that he felt the forest's attention shift toward him. There was no logical explanation for this sensation. The trees continued their patient growth. The rain maintained its rhythm. A varied thrush called from somewhere in the canopy, its haunting double note perfectly normal. But Chris's grandmother had taught him that attention had a quality, a texture, and what focused on him now from deeper in the forest felt less like consciousness than like hunger shaped into awareness. He tried raising Emily on the radio. Static answered. At marker 12, he found the first sign, a piece of yellow surveying tape tied around a hemlock sapling, but tied in a pattern that violated every NPS protocol. Instead of a simple bow, someone had created an intricate knot that resembled a figure 8 laid over a cross. Chris touched it with one gloved finger and felt wrongness radiate up his arm like voltage. His grandmother's voice, memory, or something else. Strigoi marks. Protection that invites what it fears. He pushed the thought away, but it clung like the moss clung to everything in this forest. The trail grew steeper as it climbed toward the western fork. Chris's breathing synchronized with his footfalls, became meditative, and in that meditative state, he noticed things he shouldn't have been able to notice. The way certain trees had deep scratches in their bark, too high for elk, too deliberate for bears. The way the moss grew thicker on one side of the trail, as though avoiding something on the other. The way the rain falling through the canopy created shadows that moved against the wind. Marker 14 appeared at 4:23 p.m., elevation 247 feet according to the GPS. The trail split here, the main branch continuing along the Hoh River, the smaller path branching northwest toward the Bogachil drainage. Emily's boot prints were still visible in the mud, filling slowly with rain. She'd taken the northwest fork, and there, at the base of marker 14, she'd left her radio. Chris picked it up with hands that wanted to shake. The device was intact, battery indicator showing 3/4 charge. No reason for her to abandon it. He keyed the transmit button, heard his own voice emerge from the radio on his hip with a half-second delay. The unit functioned perfectly. She'd left it deliberately. Beyond the marker, the forest changed character. The massive Sitka spruces gave way to a denser mix of hemlock and Douglas fir, and the understory thickened with salal and devil's club. The trail narrowed to barely a foot wide, more game path than maintained route. Chris consulted his topographic map. This region showed scattered elevation markers but no labeled features. Off-trail, unmapped. Emily's boot prints continued northwest, her stride length indicating she'd been running. Chris followed, radio in one hand, the other resting on the small leather pouch in his pack's pocket. The temperature dropped perceptibly, which shouldn't have been possible. He was ascending, yes, but only another 100 feet or so. Yet his breath began to mist and the rain took on a peculiar quality, drops that felt heavier than water, that left his skin feeling abraded rather than wet. After half a mile, he found her first equipment cache, her GPS unit, placed carefully on a flat stone, screen still glowing. Her track log showed she'd made it another quarter-mile northwest before the device was abandoned. But the coordinates troubled him. According to the Garmin, she'd achieved an elevation of 1,820 feet. Impossible. The topographic map showed this area maxing out at 1,600 feet. He photographed the GPS screen with his digital camera, a Canon PowerShot, the closest thing to smartphone technology available in 2007, and continued following her trail. The boot prints led to a depression in the forest floor, a bowl-shaped hollow perhaps 40 feet across where the trees grew in a perfect circle around empty space. Moss covered the ground in the hollow so thickly that walking on it felt like walking on flesh. In the exact center stood a wooden cross, rotted nearly through, leaning at a 40-degree angle. Carved into the crossbeam, barely visible beneath decades of moss and decay, Stanislav Kovac, 1952-1994. And beneath it, in newer letters, carved with something sharp and hurried, Necropny. Chris's Czech wasn't fluent, but his grandmother had taught him enough. Necropny, unburied, improperly returned to earth. Around the grave, Emily had arranged 7 stones in a pattern Chris recognized from his grandmother's whispered warnings. An old Romanian ward against strigoi mort, the dead that walk. The stones were placed incorrectly, though. She'd reversed the pattern, creating not a barrier but an invitation. That's when he heard the breathing. Not wind through trees, not the rain's percussion, but respiration, steady, patient, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Chris turned slowly, scanning the tree line encircling the hollow. Nothing moved, but the quality of attention he'd felt earlier had intensified, focused now with such predatory precision that his skin prickled despite the cold. Emily? His voice absorbed into the moss-dampened air, traveling no distance at all. The breathing continued, slower now, as though whatever produced it was savoring his awareness of its presence. Chris's hand found the leather pouch. His fingers worked at the drawstring, muscle memory from childhood when his grandmother would make him practice opening it quickly. Inside, a mixture of ash and salt, a small iron nail, 3 seeds of some kind he'd never identified. He'd thought it superstition, the residue of old-world fears that had no place in a forest managed by the National Park Service. But the breathing grew closer, and Chris felt something his training had never prepared him for. The certainty that death could wear shapes other than cessation, that it could think and plan and hunger with an intelligence older than the trees surrounding him. Movement, finally. Not in the tree line, but in the shadows between the trees. A figure resolved from darkness, walking with a gait that was wrong in subtle ways. Knees bending slightly backward, shoulders rotating in sockets that permitted too much range of motion. It wore what might once have been logging gear, canvas pants and a flannel shirt, but the clothing hung on its frame like wet newspaper. The face, though. The face was carefully composed into humanity, and Chris recognized the photograph he'd seen once in the station's archival files. Stanislav Kovac, age 42, Romanical immigrant, employed by Ho River Timber Company. The same high cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes, the same gray-streaked beard. Except the eyes didn't blink, and the mouth smiled around too many teeth. "You have the sight," it said. And its voice was Emily's voice, was Garza's voice, was Chris's grandmother's voice, layered over itself like recording tape played backward. She had it too, weak but present, enough to see what I am, enough to come seeking. Chris's training screamed at him to retreat, to call for backup, to treat this as a mental health crisis or a violent encounter. But his grandmother's training, the lessons he dismissed as dementia and cultural superstition, provided different instructions. Never run, never let it know your prey, never speak its name. "Where is Ranger Vasquez?" Chris kept his voice level, professional. The thing wearing Kovac's face tilted its head, neck articulating in ways that suggested too many vertebrae. "Where all who see must go, into the earth, improperly, into the spaces between proper death and proper living." It took a step closer, and Chris noticed it left no footprints in the moss. She came investigating me, heard the old stories from locals, the warnings, thought she was brave. The smile widened. Thought she could help. Release me. Send me home. And you killed her. I corrected her. Another step. The temperature dropped further, Chris's breath now coming in thick plumes. She had the sight, but not the knowledge. Tried to perform a blessing. Used the wrong words, the wrong pattern. Opened the door instead of closing it. The thing gestured toward the stones Emily had arranged. See? She invited me deeper into her. Now she feeds the roots, and the roots feed me. And I walk these woods, as I've walked them since they buried me wrong. In the wrong earth with the wrong rights. Chris's hand closed around the leather pouch. What do you want? Want? The thing seemed genuinely puzzled. I want nothing. I am want itself. I am the hunger that remains when flesh forgets how to rest. I am... Chris threw the pouch's contents directly at the thing's face. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The figure recoiled, smoke erupting from wherever the ash and salt made contact. But it didn't scream. Instead, it laughed, a sound like roots cracking through stones, like water freezing and expanding. The human features sloughed away, revealing something underneath that Chris's mind refused to process completely. Flesh that was also wood, bone that was also stone, a geometry that existed in too many dimensions for his visual cortex to interpret. Grandmother's protections, it said, voice no longer trying to mimic humanity. Old knowledge, good, better this way, better when you understand what takes you. It lunged. Chris ran, not along the trail which he understood instinctively was what it wanted, but perpendicular, crashing through Devil's Club and Salal, accepting the thorns tearing at his clothes and skin as preferable to what pursued him. The GPS bounced against his chest. Useless now. He'd entered the realm where coordinates and elevation were negotiable concepts. Behind him, the breathing intensified, multiplied, as though a dozen sets of lungs pumped in synchronization. Trees whipped past, their moss-covered trunks blurring into green walls. Chris's mind cataloged details with the hyper-clarity of absolute terror. The way the rain now fell upward in certain spots, the way shadows pooled on top of tree branches, the way his footprints filled not with water but with something darker and more viscous. He burst into a clearing and immediately understood this was wrong. That clearings didn't exist in old-growth forests without human intervention. This space had been carved from the forest by intention, and the stumps ringing its perimeter were too regular, too deliberately placed. In the clearing's center, a structure. Not a building exactly. More like the memory of a building. A logging camp bunkhouse reconstructed from fog and rot. The walls existed in the same not-quite-real space as the thing pursuing him, substantial enough to block rain but too translucent for solidity, and sitting on the bunkhouse steps waiting with infinite patience, Emily Vasquez. She looked up as Chris entered the clearing, and her face held such profound sadness that he stopped running despite the breathing closing in behind him. She appeared completely intact, no visible injuries, her ranger uniform still crisp and clean. Only her eyes betrayed the truth. They were too dark, pupil and iris merged into uniform blackness. "Chris," she said, her real voice this time. "I'm sorry. I thought I could help him. Thought I understood the old stories." She gestured to the not-quite building behind her. "This is where they housed the timber crews. 1887 to 1932. 43 men died here. Disease, accidents, one murder-suicide. They're all still here, in the wood, in the earth. And Kovac, he's the newest, the angriest. He wasn't supposed to be buried here at all." The breathing had stopped. Chris turned slowly, found the Kovac thing standing at the clearing's edge, watching, waiting. "Why?" Chris asked Emily. "Why you?" "Because I have the sight like you. Like your grandmother. We're sensitive to the places where death doesn't settle properly." Emily stood, moved down the steps with motions that were becoming less human by the second. "He didn't kill me, Chris. I killed myself. Used the wrong ritual, said the wrong prayers, and opened myself to what shouldn't enter living flesh. Now I'm becoming what he is. Another Strigoi. Another hunger that walks." Chris's mind, trained in emergency response, sought solutions. There had to be protocols, procedures. We can get you out. Medical evaluation, psychiatric. It's been 6 hours, Chris. 6 hours since I opened the door. You think you've been tracking me for 40 minutes? Check your watch. He did. The digital display showed 11:34 p.m. Impossible. It had been 2:47 when he received her transmission. That was 8 hours and 47 minutes. Time doesn't work the same here, Emily continued. Where death walks improperly, where burial was wrong and rest impossible, the living world and the dead world overlap. You've been in that overlap since marker 14, since you picked up my radio. She took a step toward him, and Chris saw the change accelerating. Her movements becoming predatory, her breathing slowing to that same patient rhythm he'd heard from the Kovach thing. I left the radio so you'd know to come, so you'd understand before the change finished. Understand what? That there's a way out. For me. Maybe for all of them. Emily's hand reached toward the bunkhouse, and Chris saw now that the structure's walls contained faces. Dozens of them. Timber workers trapped in the wood that had killed them, their expressions frozen in eternal suffocation. Kovach told me, before the ritual went wrong, the old ways, the Romanian ways, they have procedures for strigoi, reburial, proper rites. But it requires someone with the sight to perform them, someone living, someone strong enough to enter this overlap and not lose themselves. The Kovach thing moved closer, circling. She speaks truth. The living one with sight can release us, send us properly to rest, end the hunger. Its voice held something almost human now, hope, or perhaps the memory of hope. But the living one must choose, must accept the weight of our deaths, carry them temporarily, perform the burial that was denied. Chris's grandmother had prepared him for this without telling him, he realized. The pouch, the lessons, the stories she'd told that he'd dismissed as superstition. She'd had the sight too, had known he'd inherited it, had given him tools for a moment exactly like this. What happens if I perform the ritual? Chris asked. You carry us temporarily, Kovach said. Feel what we feel. The hunger, the wrongness, the inability to rest. Then you speak the proper words, trace the proper symbols, and send us back to the earth correctly. We sleep. You live. And if I refuse? Emily answered. I become like him. Another predator in these woods. Another reason hikers disappear and rangers find only equipment. Another story locals whisper about but never report. Her voice cracked, briefly human again. I don't want that, Chris. Please. Chris looked between Emily, transforming, losing herself, and the Kovach thing, and the faces trapped in the phantom bunkhouse walls. His training said this was delusion, shared psychosis, possibly environmental contamination causing hallucinations. His grandmother's training said this was venimani, perception of the world's true architecture, and he'd been chosen to stand at this intersection of death and life precisely because he could see both sides. He thought of the leather pouch, empty now but still warm against his chest, of his grandmother's hands, wrinkled and strong, teaching him prayers in Czech he'd never bothered to fully learn, of the weight she'd carried without complaint, the sensitivity she'd accepted as both gift and burden. Teach me the ritual, Chris said. What happened next would live in his nerve endings forever. Kovach's hands, cold as permafrost, gripping his wrists. Emily's voice, reciting syllables in Romanian and Latin, words that hurt to hear. The sensation of 43 deaths plus one entering him sequentially, each a unique symphony of pain and wrongness. The logger crushed under a falling Douglas fir in 1889. The cook who died of pneumonia in 1901, lungs filling with fluid while his crewmates slept 6 feet away. The young timber faller who'd murdered his bunkmate over a gambling debt, then hanged himself from a ridge beam in 1918, and Stanislav Kovach, who'd fallen into a ravine in 1994, broken his spine, and lain paralyzed for 3 days while hypothermia slowly claimed him. Who'd been found by a tourist, who died in a helicopter en route to the hospital, whose family had demanded he be buried according to Romanian Orthodox traditions, but whose body had been interred by the county before the proper arrangements could be made, who'd woken in the wrong earth, in the wrong way, and learned that consciousness could persist without the merciful limitation of flesh. Each death was a language Chris had to learn to speak, a story he had to carry in his cellular memory. The weight was unbearable. His knees buckled. Blood began streaming from his nose, his ears, his tear ducts. The human body rejecting information it wasn't designed to process. But his grandmother's training held. Some part of him remembered the prayers, the gestures, the way to fold death properly so it could rest. His hands moved in patterns he'd seen her trace in empty air, creating symbols that existed for only a moment before dissolving, but which rearranged reality in their wake. He spoke words his conscious mind didn't know, syllables that bypassed his tongue and emerged directly from the part of him that perceived rupture and wrongness. The clearing responded. The phantom bunkhouse grew more solid, more real, as though his words were stitching it back into the proper world. The faces in the walls began to relax, expressions shifting from agony to something approaching peace. Kovac collapsed, his not-quite body losing coherence. "Thank you," he said in his own voice, finally his own. "Mulchumesk, tell them I tried to go home. Tell them." But he was gone before finishing, dispersing into the forest floor like morning mist. Emily lasted longer. Chris held her as the transformation reversed, as the darkness left her eyes, and normal brown iris returned. She smiled, briefly and genuinely. "Thank you, Chris. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to—" "You were strong enough to call for help," Chris said. "That's strength too." She died in his arms at 11:47 p.m. Died properly this time, her body becoming just a body, the unnatural animation leaving her muscles. Chris held her for a long time, rain washing the blood from both their faces, feeling the deaths he'd carried beginning to settle into memory rather than present sensation. When he finally stood, GPS and radio in hand, he found he could trace the route back to marker 14 by dead reckoning. The overlap had collapsed. He was in the normal forest now, the one governed by topography and weather patterns and mundane cause and effect. He carried Emily's body out himself, arriving at the trailhead parking area at 4:15 a.m. The search and rescue team was waiting, Garza among them, relief and horror crossing his face as Chris emerged from the darkness. "Found her at marker 16, Chris said, using the lies that would go in the official report. "Apparent fall, head trauma, died before I could reach her. No signs of foul play." The lies were necessary. Truth required belief, and belief required the sight. And Chris understood now why his grandmother had carried her knowledge so quietly, never demanding others perceive what she perceived. They debriefed him for 6 hours. Medical evaluation found him dehydrated, hypothermic, suffering from minor lacerations and extreme exhaustion. The blood test came back negative for drugs, alcohol, anything that might explain his confused timeline and vague answers. Emily's autopsy found exactly what Chris said it would. Blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. Time of death estimated at 11:45 p.m. Cause of death, misadventure. The official report cited inadequate training for solo backcountry patrol. New protocols were implemented. A memorial was held. Emily's parents attended, quiet and devastated, and Chris thought about telling them their daughter had been brave enough to try helping something that suffered. But he said nothing, understanding that some stories only tormented without providing closure. He returned to his duties, but something had changed. The forest that had been his workplace was now a text he could read in a language he was only beginning to understand. He perceived the places where death pooled improperly, the clearings where the overlap between worlds grew thin, the trails that led to destinations not marked on any USGS topographic map. He started carrying new equipment alongside his Motorola and Garmin, ash and salt in proportions his grandmother would have approved. Iron nails blessed by a priest in Seattle who asked no questions. Seeds from plants that grew only in the spaces between proper life and proper death. Sometimes on night patrols he encountered things that made the Kovac entity seem almost benign. Hungers older than the logging camps, older than European contact, older than the Quinault people who'd learned to give certain groves a wide berth. He performed the rituals his grandmother had taught him, sent them to proper rest when he could, marked the locations when he couldn't. The Forest Service awarded him a commendation for recovering Emily's body under difficult conditions. He accepted it, said the appropriate words, and knew they were honoring a fiction. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Christopher Brennan had inherited a responsibility older than parks and rangers and GPS coordinates. He walked the boundaries between the living world and the dead world, carried the weight of deaths that couldn't rest, and performed services that had no official protocols. He thought about Emily constantly, about her courage in seeking help even as she transformed into something that no longer needed rescue. About her last smile, briefly human, briefly at peace, and late at night when rain drummed against his cabin roof with that particular weight unique to the Olympic Peninsula, he felt the forest's attention on him. Not predatory now, but expectant, patient, waiting for the next rupture that would require someone with the sight to stand in the overlap and say, "Not here, not this way, return to proper rest." His grandmother had warned him, in the last months before dementia claimed her completely, that the gift was also a curse, that those who perceived death's architecture were doomed to become its maintenance crew, perpetually walking the boundaries, perpetually carrying the weight of those who couldn't carry themselves. She'd been right. Chris opened his desk drawer, pulled out the leather pouch, refilled now with ash and salt and the small iron nail he'd have to consecrate again before the next patrol. He ran his fingers over the worn leather, feeling the warmth that indicated something in the forest had died improperly, that the overlap was forming again, that someone with the sight would need to enter that terrible space between worlds and perform the work that official reports would never acknowledge. He checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. His next patrol started at 6. The rain continued its patient percussion against the roof, and somewhere in the darkness of the Hoh rainforest, in the places where moss covered everything and death learned to walk, something waited for the living to notice it. Something always waited. And Chris would go because Emily had taught him that courage wasn't about being strong enough to face death alone, but about being brave enough to ask for help, and compassionate enough to answer when others asked. He closed his eyes and felt the 44 deaths he'd carried settling into his bones like sediment, like weight, like the rain that never stopped falling. His grandmother's gift, his grandmother's curse, his responsibility now, until someone else with the sight learned to perceive the overlap and inherited this terrible, necessary work. The rain kept falling, the forest kept growing, and death kept learning new ways to avoid rest. And Christopher Brennan kept walking the boundaries, kept carrying the weight, kept performing rituals that had no names in any official language, because someone had to, because Emily had asked, because the sight demanded it. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Chris afterward. Christopher Hayes had been staring at the topographic map for 20 minutes when the pattern finally revealed itself. 5 red pins, 5 disappearances across Superior National Forest over the past 18 months. Emily Thornton's face smiled from the missing person flyer taped to the edge of his desk. 24 years old, brown hair, last seen on the Echo Trail 3 days ago. But it was the placement of those pins that made his coffee turn cold in his mouth. The October morning light slanted through the ranger station windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like ash. Chris pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up and leaned closer to the map. The pins formed something. Not random at all. He pulled out his compass, drew lines between the disappearance sites with a pencil. The shape made his hand pause mid-stroke. A 5-pointed figure. Not quite a perfect star, but close enough that coincidence seemed obscene. "You're doing it again," Sarah Blackfeather said from the doorway. The seasonal ranger carried 2 fresh mugs of coffee, steam rising in the cold air of the station. Connecting dots that don't want to be connected. "Look at this." Chris accepted the coffee but didn't drink. Janet Morrison disappeared March 2006. Tyler Chen, July 2006. Marcus Webb, January 2007. Rebecca Yates, June 2007. Now Emily Thornton, October 2007. All during new moons, all approximately 12 miles from each other. And look, he traced the lines again. They form a geometric pattern centered on Hegman Lake. Sarah moved closer, her long black hair catching the light. She was Ojibwe from the Fond du Lac Reservation, and she studied the map with the same analytical precision Chris appreciated in a colleague. That's old territory, real old. My grandmother's people didn't go near Hegman in winter. Still don't, the few who remember why. Why? Chris looked up. In his 3 years stationed at Superior, he'd learned to respect Sarah's knowledge. She understood these woods in ways his biology degree from Wisconsin never could. She was quiet for a moment, dark eyes still fixed on the map. There are stories about the lakes up there, about what happens when someone gets lost in winter, when the hunger comes. She seemed to choose her words carefully. Wendigo stories. Chris felt something twist in his stomach. He'd read about Wendigo mythology, cannibalistic spirits from Algonquian folklore, creatures of endless hunger, academic curiosity, nothing more. You're talking about legends. I'm talking about why my people avoided those woods for 300 years. Sarah's voice held no superstition, just flat statement of fact. And I'm talking about how all 5 of your disappeared people vanished during Makwa Gizig, new moon, when the darkness is complete. That's not a coincidence we ignore. The Garmin GPS unit on Chris's desk beeped. Low battery warning. He'd been meaning to charge it. His flip phone sat beside it, displaying no service as it had for the past hour. The towers out here were sparse in 2007, unreliable on the best days. His Motorola radio crackled with static, someone's transmission breaking up across the frequency. The search teams found nothing, Chris said, pulling Emily's file folder across his desk. Her car was at the Echo Trail parking area. Tent was set up at campsite 14. Food still in the bear canister. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Just gone, like she evaporated. Like the others? Exactly like the others. Chris opened the folder, scanning his own notes from the previous disappearances. He'd consulted on all of them, providing biological assessments, analyzing animal activity, ruling out predators. No bear activity, no wolf tracks. The K9 units lost the scent within 50 yards every single time. Each person vanished between dusk and dawn. Each one an experienced outdoors person. And each one... He stopped, noticing something he'd missed before. What? Chris pulled out the 4 previous incident reports, laying them side by side. They all reported the same thing in their last known communications: feeling hungry, intensely, painfully hungry, even though they'd just eaten. He found Emily's last text message, sent to her boyfriend at 7:43 p.m. 3 nights ago. Weird. Just demolished 2 freeze-dried meals and I'm still starving. Like I haven't eaten in days. Going to try to sleep it off. She'd never sent another message. The Wendigo makes you hungry, Sarah said quietly. That's how the stories start. You're in the woods, and the cold gets into you, and you start to feel hunger that food can't touch. It digs into your bones, makes you think things you shouldn't think, want things you shouldn't want. Chris stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the forest stretched in endless waves of pine and birch, already touched by early snow. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees overnight. By evening, it would be near 0. I need to go up there, to Hegman Lake. If there's a pattern, there might be a central location, some kind of staging area, maybe a survivalist camp, or you find whatever took 5 people and never left tracks, Sarah interrupted. Chris, I know you. You see the world through data and evidence. But some things don't care about your methodology. Some things are older than science. He turned back to her. I can't just accept that explanation. There has to be a rational. Then take this. Sarah crossed to her locker, pulled out a small leather pouch on a cord. It's a sema, tobacco, and other things. My grandmother made it. She said if I ever felt the hunger in the deep woods, I should burn it. The smoke keeps certain things at bay. Chris took the pouch, feeling its weight. It smelled of dried plants and something else, something sharp and clean. Sarah, I appreciate the cultural context, but you're a scientist and you need evidence. I know. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Just keep it anyway. And Chris, don't go alone. Take Davies with you. Mark Davies was the other full-time ranger at the station, a 20-year veteran who knew the boundary waters better than anyone. Chris found him in the equipment room, inventorying the winter survival gear. When Chris explained his theory about the pattern and his plan to investigate Hegman Lake, Davies' weathered face creased with concern. That's 2-day territory in this weather, Davies said, his Minnesota accent thickening. Ice is forming, but it's not safe to cross yet. We'd have to hike around the long way. And if this cold snap continues, he checked the thermometer mounted outside the window. We're looking at sustained temps below zero by tonight. Emily Thornton has been missing for 3 days, Chris said. If there's any chance she's alive, then she's already dead from exposure. Davies' bluntness was harsh but practical. You know the statistics as well as I do, but he paused, organizing his thoughts the way he organized equipment. I'll tell you something. Been ranging these woods since '87. I've seen bear attacks, hypothermia, drowning, lightning strikes, normal deaths if you can call them that. But those 5 disappearances, they're not normal. Something about them feels wrong in a way I can't articulate, like the forest itself is hiding what happened. Chris pulled out his printed topographic map, now marked with his geometric pattern. If we leave within the hour, we can make it to the south shore of Hegman by nightfall. Set up camp, investigate the area at first light. 2 days, in and out. Davies studied the map for a long moment. That center point you've marked, that's near an old site. Logging camp from the 1890s, abandoned after half the crew died in a winter storm. Bodies were never recovered. The Ojibwe guides who worked there quit en masse after the incident. Walked off and refused to go back. He looked up at Chris. You think that's relevant? I think everything is potentially relevant until proven otherwise. They packed methodically, Chris's scientific training meshing with Davies' field experience. Cold weather tents, 3-season sleeping bags rated to -20, MREs, water filtration, the Garmin GPS with fresh batteries, extra radio batteries, first aid kit, emergency beacon, flares. Chris strapped on his Timberland winter boots and layered thermal underwear under his ranger uniform. His backpack weighed 43 pounds. The drive to the Echo Trail access point took 90 minutes on deteriorating forest roads. The sky had turned gray, pregnant with snow. Chris's truck thermometer read 12 degrees when they parked next to Emily's abandoned Honda Civic. Yellow police tape still marked the perimeter of the parking area. Search and rescue was here for 2 days, Davies said, surveying the scene. Dogs, volunteers, drones. Well, the drone technology in Nero 7 isn't great, but they tried. Found absolutely nothing. Chris examined Emily's car. A mathematics graduate student from Duluth, according to her file. Smart, careful, experienced. Her camping gear was high quality, her planning evident in the detailed itinerary she'd left with her boyfriend. She wasn't the type to make rookie mistakes. They shouldered their packs and headed into the forest. The Echo Trail lived up to its name. Every sound seemed to repeat itself, bouncing off the dense stands of pine and bare birch. Their boots crunched through 3 inches of snow, breaking the crystalline silence. Chris checked his GPS every 15 minutes, marking their progress. The device's blue screen glowed weakly, showing their position as a blinking dot moving deeper into wilderness. Tell me about the other disappearances, Davies said as they hiked. You've been analyzing them. What patterns besides the obvious? Chris had committed the details to memory. Janet Morrison, 56, experienced birdwatcher. Tyler Chen, 31, wildlife photographer. Marcus Webb, 44, fishing guide who knew these woods intimately. Rebecca Yates, 28, botanical researcher. All different ages, different purposes for being here. The only commonality besides the geographical pattern and the new moon timing is that they all were alone when they vanished. And the hunger. And the hunger, Chris agreed. Though that could be psychological. Stress, cold, isolation. These can all manifest as... Chris, Davies stopped walking. Look. They'd reached a small clearing. The snow here was disturbed, marked with irregular depressions that might have been footprints. But they were wrong. Too large, too oddly spaced. Chris knelt, examining them with his analytical precision. The depressions were at least 18 inches long, but the edges were strange, blurred, as if whatever made them had been both very heavy and somehow insubstantial at the same time. What makes tracks like that? Davies asked. Chris pulled out his digital camera, a Nikon Coolpix that captured decent resolution for field documentation. He photographed the tracks from multiple angles, including a ruler for scale. I don't know. The spacing suggests a bipedal gait, but the weight distribution is all wrong. And look, he pointed to where the tracks simply ended in the middle of the clearing. They don't lead anywhere. They just stop. Davies' jaw tightened. We should radio back to the station. Chris tried his Motorola. Only static. He checked his flip phone. No service. Normal for this deep in the forest. We knew we'd be out of contact, he said. That's why we have the emergency beacon if we need it. They pressed on. The forest grew denser, the light dimming despite it being only mid-afternoon. Chris's breath formed clouds that hung in the motionless air. The temperature was dropping faster than the forecast had predicted. His weather-resistant watch showed 3:47 p.m. Sunset would come around 5:30 in late October. They needed to make progress. You smell that? Davies asked suddenly. Chris stopped, inhaled. There, faint but distinct. Something rotten, organic decay mixed with something else. Something that made his hindbrain recoil. Dead animal, maybe? Maybe. Davies didn't sound convinced. They found the source 20 minutes later. A deer carcass, partially buried in snow. But it had been fed upon in a way that made Chris's scientific detachment crack. The animal had been systematically stripped, bones cracked open and hollowed, as if something had been desperate to extract every calorie. But it was the marks on the bones that disturbed him most. Scratches that looked almost like human fingernails except impossibly deep, gouging into the bone itself. Bear? Davies suggested, though his tone said he knew it wasn't. Chris photographed the carcass, measured the bone gouges. Bears hibernate, and their feeding patterns don't look like this. This is... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. This is what something starving would do. Something with clever hands and relentless hunger. The sun was touching the horizon when they finally reached the southern shore of Hegman Lake. The water had begun its seasonal freeze, ice forming in fragile sheets near the banks. Beyond, the lake stretched black and cold. On the far shore, barely visible in the failing light, Chris could make out the rocky outcroppings that marked the approximate center of his geometric pattern. They set up camp with practiced efficiency, tent secured against the wind, sleeping bags laid out, their small camping stove heating water for coffee. Chris pulled out his map and GPS, confirming their position. They were less than a mile from the pattern's focal point. We'll investigate at first light, Davies said, wrapping his hands around his metal coffee mug. Get a full day to cover the area, then head back tomorrow night. Chris nodded, but his eyes kept drifting across the lake. Somewhere out there, Emily Thornton had disappeared. Somewhere in this frozen wilderness, 5 people had simply ceased to exist. And despite all his scientific training, all his rational analysis, he couldn't shake Sarah's words about the Wendigo. He pulled out the leather pouch she'd given him, turning it over in his hands. The tobacco inside rustled softly. What's that? Davies asked. Insurance, Chris said, against things that shouldn't exist. They ate MREs in silence as darkness completed its claim on the forest. Chris's thermometer now read 8 degrees. The cold was absolute, pressing in like a physical presence. He zipped his sleeping bag to his chin and tried to rest, but his mind kept working through the data, searching for patterns, for logical explanations. The sound woke him around 2 a.m. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through snow, circling their tent. Chris's hand found his flashlight. Beside him, Davies was already awake, breathing shallow. They both knew the sound of deer, of moose, of bears. This was bipedal, human-like. But the stride was wrong, too long, and between steps came a sound like wind through a hollow tree. The footsteps stopped outside the tent entrance. Chris could hear breathing, wet, ragged, hungry. He thought of Emily Thornton's last text. "I'm still starving, like I haven't eaten in days." "Chris," a voice whispered from outside. Emily's voice cracked and desperate. "Chris, please, I'm so hungry. Please let me in. I need... Davies grabbed Chris's arm, shook his head violently. His weathered face was pale in the darkness. "Please," Emily's voice continued, but it was changing, deepening, becoming something that shouldn't emerge from a human throat. "So hungry, so empty. Let me in. Let me fill this emptiness." Chris's hands trembled as he reached for the radio, knowing it was useless, but needing to try. Only static answered. His GPS screen glowed with its pathetic blue light, showing their position as a dot surrounded by digital emptiness. The breathing outside grew louder, more agitated. Then the footsteps resumed, circling, never stopping, and Chris realized that whatever was out there was wearing down their sanity as methodically as the wind wore down stone. Davies pulled a hunting knife from his pack, held it ready. The gesture seemed absurd, primitive, but Chris found himself grateful for it. The circling continued until dawn. When pale light finally seeped through the tent fabric, the footsteps stopped. Chris waited 5 more minutes before unzipping the entrance with shaking hands. The snow outside their tent was churned into chaos. Tracks everywhere. Those same impossibly large blurred impressions they'd seen earlier. But these were deeper, more aggressive, and they circled their tent exactly 47 times. Chris counted them, needing the precision, the concrete data to anchor himself. "That wasn't Emily," Davies said flatly. "No." Chris's voice came out hoarse. "Whatever that was, it knew her name. It knew my name. We should leave. Now." But Chris was looking across the lake, at the rocky outcroppings on the far shore. The sun was rising behind them, backlighting something that made his breath catch, shapes carved into the rock face. Large, angular, deliberate. "We're so close," he said. "The center of the pattern is right there. Chris, give me today, just today. If we don't find anything concrete by afternoon, we leave. But those markings," he pointed, "that's evidence. Real, physical evidence." Davies stared at him for a long moment. "You're doing what they all probably did, pushing deeper when you should run. The pattern isn't just geographical, Chris. It's behavioral. Whatever's out there, it draws you in." "Then help me resist it," Chris said. "Help me stay rational. But I need to see those markings." They broke camp quickly, packing everything they might need for a rapid exit. The lake ice was thicker now after the frigid night, but still too dangerous to trust. They'd have to hike around the shoreline, adding 3 miles to their approach. The forest felt different in daylight. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating corridors that twisted vision. Chris's compass began acting erratically, the needle spinning without settling. His GPS signal flickered in and out. "Magnetic anomaly?" he suggested, but Davies just grunted skeptically. They found the first piece of evidence 1/2 mile along the shore, a backpack partially buried in snow. Chris recognized it from the missing persons file, Marcus Webb's expensive REI pack. He photographed it in place before carefully examining the contents. Webb's journal was inside. The last entry dated January 15, 2007, the day he disappeared. Chris read it aloud. "Can't explain this hunger. Ate everything I brought. Starting to think about things I shouldn't. The cold makes it worse. Makes you understand why the old stories talked about people in winter eating things they shouldn't eat. The forest has teeth. I can feel them closing." "We need to leave," Davy said. "Right now." But Chris was already moving toward the rocky outcroppings, driven by something he couldn't name. Need to know. Need to understand. His scientific mind demanded completion, demanded answers. The markings on the rock face were extensive, carved deep into the granite, weathered by decades of exposure but still clearly visible. They weren't random. Chris recognized some symbols from his research into Algonquian pictographs. Others were stranger, more disturbing. "These are warnings," Davies said, studying the carvings. "I've seen Ojibwe rock art before. These symbols, they're marking this as forbidden territory, a place of Wendigo." "Wendigo," Chris corrected automatically, his pronunciation more academic. But his hands were shaking as he photographed the carvings. In the center of the rock face was a larger symbol, a human figure with an animal skull for a head, ribs visible through emaciated flesh, hands ending in claws. Around it, smaller figures ran or cowered. "No," Davies said. "I said it right. Wendigo, the original word, before anthropologists cleaned it up." He pointed to markings below the central figure. "That's the old logging camp. And those..." He indicated a series of notches carved into the stone. "Those are tallies, 16 marks. 16 people. The logging crew that had vanished in the 1890s. Chris felt his stomach drop. 5 disappearances in the present day, 16 historical victims, 21 total. He pulled out his map with trembling hands, studying the geometric pattern he'd drawn. 5 points to a star. A pentagram requires 5 elements, but 16 plus 5. His mind raced through the math, the patterns. What if the 5 recent disappearances are completing something that started over a century ago? "Chris." Davies's voice was tight. "The sun's getting lower. We've been here longer than you think." Chris checked his watch. It was 4:17 p.m. They'd lost hours somehow. The walk here should have taken 90 minutes at most, but his watch claimed they'd been moving through the forest for over 7 hours. "Time displacement," he muttered, but that made no scientific sense. Nothing about this made sense. The sound came from the tree line behind them, that wet, ragged breathing. Chris spun, fumbling for his flashlight even though daylight remained. The breathing grew louder, multiplying, coming from multiple directions. "They're hurting us," Davies said, pulling his knife. "Away from our escape route." Chris's analytical mind processed the tactical situation even as terror clawed at his composure. They were backed against the rock face, the lake behind them, breathing things in the forest cutting off their return path. The only option was across the lake ice. "It won't hold our weight," he said. "We don't have a choice." The breathing resolved into shapes, figures emerging from between the trees. They moved wrong, joints bending at angles that shouldn't work, skin hanging loose over skeletal frames. Chris recognized Emily Thornton's hiking jacket on one of them, Marcus Webb's distinctive red hat on another. But their faces were wrong, stretched and hollow, mouths too wide, filled with teeth that had been filed to points. "Wendigo," Davies breathed. "Jesus Christ, they're all Wendigo." Chris's scientific mind tried to catalog what he was seeing, tried to find rational explanation. Rabies? Some kind of prion disease causing aggressive behavior and emaciation. But he knew he was lying to himself. What was walking toward them wasn't disease. It was hunger given form. Hunger that had consumed 5 people and transformed them into something that existed only to feed. The figures stopped at the tree line, swaying. One of them, the one wearing Emily's jacket, spoke in that too-deep voice he'd heard outside the tent. "Join us, Christopher. The hunger stops when you give in. The cold stops, everything stops except the feeding. It's beautiful, it's release." "We're going across the ice," Chris said, grabbing Davies' arm. "It's suicide. Staying is certain death." They ran for the lake, boots hitting the ice with cracks that sounded like gunshots. Behind them, the Wendigo thing surged forward, their footsteps thunderous. Chris's backpack bounced against his spine, the GPS unit digging into his lower back. The ice groaned beneath them, spiderwebbing with fractures. "Keep moving," Davies shouted. "Don't stop." The ice split 20 feet from shore. Chris felt himself falling, the black water rising to meet him. cold so intense it was pain. His pack dragged him down. He thrashed, fighting against the weight, against the water filling his clothes. Davies's hand grabbed his collar, hauling him upward with desperate strength. They broke the surface together, scrambling onto thicker ice, water flash freezing in their clothing. The Wendigo stood at the shore, watching with hollow eyes but not following. "They can't cross running water," Davies gasped. "Old folklore. Moving water is purification, even frozen." "Move," Chris managed through chattering teeth. "Hypothermia. Minutes." They staggered across the remaining ice and into the forest on the far side, putting distance between themselves and those watching figures. Chris's clothes were already stiffening, ice forming in the fabric. His core temperature was plummeting. He had perhaps 15 minutes before his body began shutting down. Davies pulled emergency thermal blankets from his pack, wrapped one around Chris. "We need fire. Now." But Chris's hands were too numb to work matches. Davies took over, building a small fire with practiced speed using pine needles and birch bark. The flames caught, grew. Chris pressed close to the heat, feeling returning to his extremities in agonizing waves. "The pouch," he said through clicking teeth. "Sarah's pouch. In my pack." Davies found it, the leather surprisingly dry. Inside was tobacco and other herbs Chris couldn't identify. Davies threw a handful onto the flames. The smoke that rose was thick and white, smelling of sage and something sharper. The Wendigo things that had been approaching through the trees stopped, backing away from the smoke. One of them, Tyler Chen, Chris thought, recognizing the photographer's distinctive tattoo sleeve, hissed like burning wood. "The smoke keeps them at bay," Davies said. "Your friend Sarah knew." Chris's mind was clearing as his core temperature stabilized. His GPS had shattered in the fall, useless now. His radio was waterlogged. His phone was dead. They were cut off, alone, with no way to call for help and miles from the nearest road. "We can't stay here," he said. "The fire won't last. The smoke won't last. Then we move, now, while they're still hesitant." They grabbed their packs and ran, following the GPS coordinates Chris had memorized before the unit died. South-southeast, 3.6 miles to the Echo Trail parking area. They had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left. The Wendigo followed at a distance visible between trees, keeping pace but not attacking. Chris understood with sickening clarity what was happening. They were being herded again, driven toward something. The disappearances weren't random violence, they were selection. Careful, deliberate selection. "The pattern," he gasped as they ran. "The geometric pattern. It's not marking where they disappeared. It's marking where they were transformed. This whole area is one massive hunting ground. The center point, those rock carvings, that's the source. The original Wendigo, maybe from the 1890s. It created the others. How do we stop it?" Chris's analytical mind raced through folklore, through everything Sarah had told him. Wendigo can only be killed by fire, complete immolation, but we don't have enough fuel for something that large, and if there's a primary entity creating the others. A figure stepped onto the path ahead of them. This one was different from the others, larger, older, its body wrapped in rotting furs from another century. Its face was a desiccated skull, eye sockets empty but somehow seeing. When it opened its mouth, its voice was wind through winter trees. "You understand now, Christopher Hayes. The hunger never ends. It only spreads. 16 souls were not enough. 5 more were needed. And now you will complete the pattern. 21 souls to break the binding, to let the hunger spread beyond these woods. You did the mathematics. You drew the symbol yourself. You invited us in." Chris's blood turned to ice. The map. His careful plotting of the disappearance sites, the lines he'd drawn. He'd created a ritual diagram without knowing it, had focused his intention on the pattern, had given it power through his analysis. "No," he whispered. "Yes, the rational mind is easiest to trap. So certain of its logic, it never sees the trap until sprung." The ancient Wendigo took a step closer. "Your friend will be 21. You will be 22. And then we feast on civilization. Davies raised his hunting knife, a pathetic defense. But Chris was thinking, calculating. 21 souls to break a binding. The rock carvings were warnings, but also wards, holding something back. The original disappearances in the 1890s had been stopped somehow, contained but not destroyed. And now, through his investigation, through his rational mapping, he'd weakened those wards. The tobacco, he said suddenly. All of it. On the creature. What? Trust me. Davies threw him the pouch. Chris pulled out the emergency flare from his pack, waterproof, designed to burn at 2,000 degrees. His hands shook as he twisted the cap, but his mind was clear. Science hadn't failed him. He'd just been asking the wrong questions. The ancient Wendigo lunged forward with impossible speed. Chris jerked the flare ignition cord, thrust the burning phosphorus into the leather pouch, and hurled the entire blazing package directly into the creature's open mouth. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Wendigo staggered, clawing at its throat as the blessed tobacco and burning chemicals ignited something deep within its desiccated form. Fire erupted from its eye sockets, its mouth, spreading across its body like liquid. The creature's shriek was the sound of winter wind and starving madness, and it drove both men to their knees. The other Wendigo, the 5 transformed victims, began convulsing, as if the destruction of the primary entity was affecting them. Emily Thornton's hollowed form collapsed into the snow, and for a moment her face became human again, almost peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered, before her body began to burn from within. One by one, the transformed victims ignited, their forms consumed by ethereal fire that left no ash, no residue. Chris watched through tears as 5 people he'd tried to save found release in burning. The ancient Wendigo remained, even as flames consumed it, and its voice echoed through the forest. "There are others, older than me, hungrier than me. You have won nothing, Christopher Hayes, only delayed the inevitable hunger." Then it was gone, leaving only scorched earth and the smell of burned tobacco. They ran again, pushing through exhaustion and cold, until they reached the Echo Trail parking area just as full darkness fell. Emily's Honda Civic still sat abandoned, police tape fluttering in the wind. Chris's truck was exactly where they'd left it. The drive back was silent. Davies's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. Chris stared out the window at the endless forest, thinking about patterns he'd seen, wards he'd weakened, hungers he'd barely survived. When they reached the ranger station, Sarah was waiting. She took one look at them and knew. "The Wendigo?" she asked quietly. "5 of them," Chris said. "Victims from the disappearances. And something older, something from the 1890s. We stopped it, I think." "You think?" He showed her his ruined notes, the map with its geometric pattern. "I drew this. My analysis, my rational investigation. It was completing a ritual I didn't understand. I was feeding the pattern with intention. If we hadn't disrupted it..." 21 souls, Sarah said, looking at the map. "That's a breaking number in the old ways. You stopped something much worse from being released." She touched his arm. "But you saw them. The transformed. That's going to stay with you." Chris nodded numbly. His scientific mind wanted to reject everything that had happened, wanted to find rational explanations. But he'd seen Emily Thornton's face in the firelight, had heard the ancient Wendigo's voice promising older hungers. The official report listed the 5 missing persons as deceased, cause unknown, remains not recovered. Chris didn't argue. How could he explain what had really happened? That they'd been consumed by hunger itself, transformed into hunger's avatar, finally released through fire and blessing. He kept working as a ranger, but he never returned to the Hegman Lake area. He studied the old Ojibwe texts, learned about wards and protections, about why certain territories were marked as forbidden. His scientific training hadn't been wrong. It had simply been incomplete. The universe contained more variables than his equations had accounted for. Sometimes on cold winter nights, Chris would wake from dreams of endless hunger, of wanting to consume everything, of teeth filed sharp and joints bending backward. In those moments, he would light a bundle of tobacco Sarah had given him, let the smoke fill his small cabin, and wait for the feeling to pass. The hunger always passed, but it never fully left. 3 months later, a hiker disappeared near Lake Superior's north shore. Then another. When Chris plotted their locations on a map, his hand trembled. They formed the beginning of a new pattern, a new geometry. Somewhere in the forest, something older and hungrier was waking up, and Chris understood with terrible clarity that his rational mind had only delayed the inevitable. The hunger was patient, the hunger was eternal, and the hunger was spreading. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what's really awakening in the forest. The Motorola XTS 5000 crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., and Thomas Mercer's hand froze halfway to his coffee mug. Static first, then a voice. Female, young, breaking apart like wet paper. "Someone here? Can't be. Please, God. Please." He knew that tone, the specific frequency of terror that stripped away everything except animal fear. He'd heard it once before, 3 years ago, and the hiker whose voice carried that same juju quality never came home. Thomas had found her pack 2 weeks later, contents scattered in a perfect circle around a Douglas fir, but Sarah Chen herself had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The official report said exposure and disorientation. The report didn't mention the way her belongings had been arranged with geometric precision, or how every compass in a 100-yard radius spun uselessly, or how Thomas had felt something watching him from the spaces between the trees, where the moss grew thick enough to swallow light. "This is Ranger Station 7, Thomas said into the radio, his voice steady through practice rather than calm. "Identify yourself and your location. Rachel Connolly, Ho River Trail, mile marker 9, I think. The fog is Jesus, the fog shouldn't move like that." The connection dissolved into white noise. Thomas checked his watch. 6:49 a.m., October 17th, 2009. First light was already filtering through the windows of his cabin at the edge of Olympic National Park, turning the perpetual mist into something that looked like pearl and felt like burial shroud. He'd been stationed here for 8 months now, requested the transfer himself after the Sarah Chen incident had carved out something vital from his center. Coming back to Washington, to the Ho rainforest, where the trees grew so dense that noon felt like dusk and the world dripped continuously even when it wasn't raining, had seemed like penance, or maybe punishment. He'd stopped distinguishing between the two. He grabbed his field pack, already loaded, always ready, because preparation was armor against the memory of failure, and checked the contents with mechanical precision. First aid kit, emergency blanket, flares, rope, Garmin eTrex GPS that worked about 60% of the time under the rainforest canopy, topographical maps in waterproof sleeves, his grandfather's compass, brass and reliable, which he trusted more than any satellite, flashlight with fresh batteries, water purification tablets, protein bars, and wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom, something he never mentioned in his incident reports. A small book his mother had given him before she died, filled with Buddhist prayers she'd learned from her own grandmother. Thomas wasn't religious, but some textures of fear made him superstitious. The drive to the Ho River trailhead took 40 minutes through forest, so thick it felt like traveling through a tunnel of living things. Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose like cathedral pillars, their bark black with moisture, their branches heavy with moss that hung in curtains thick enough to hide anything. The understory glowed that particular shade of green that existed nowhere else on Earth, the green of things that grew in shadow, that fed on rain and rot, and the endless decomposition of everything that had lived before. Thomas parked next to a silver Honda Civic with Oregon plates and a Keep Portland Weird bumper sticker. Rachel Connolly's car, presumably. He ran the plates through his radio, routine procedure, though the response would take 20 minutes minimum out here where communication crawled. The trailhead was empty, the sign-in sheet showing Rachel's name at 4:47 a.m., nearly 2 hours ago. She'd written "Solo Day Hike to 5 Mile Island" in neat handwriting, and seeing that precision, that careful documentation of intention, made something twist in Thomas's stomach. Sarah Chen had been meticulous too, had written down everything, had done everything right. It hadn't mattered. He shouldered his pack and started up the trail at a pace just short of running. The Ho River Trail wound through some of the most pristine, temperate rainforest in the continental United States, a place where nature performed its slow work of creation and destruction with the patience of something that had outlasted glaciers. The trail itself was well maintained, a ribbon of packed earth and wooden bridges threading between titans of vegetation. But maintenance meant nothing when someone left the trail. The forest swallowed people. It had been doing so long before humans arrived to name it and mark it, and convince themselves they understood it. Mile marker 1 passed, then 2. Thomas's boots squelched in mud that never fully dried. The air tasted green and thick, heavy with oxygen from all that photosynthesis, heavy with spores from all that rot. Everything here lived on top of something dead. Nurse logs sprouted entire gardens from their decomposing bodies. Mushrooms clustered like tumors on bark. Even the moss, that ubiquitous presence that covered every surface like fur, was engaged in its own patient digestion of the world. At mile marker 4, Thomas found the first anomaly. A section of trail where the moss had been disturbed, scraped aside in a pattern that made him stop and stare. Not random. Someone had cleared the moss from a fallen log to expose the wood beneath, and in that exposed surface, scratches. Deep ones, made with something sharp. They formed symbols he didn't recognize. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when he looked at them too long. Circles intersecting with lines that might have been language, or might have been decoration, or might have been something else entirely. He photographed them with his digital camera, the flash stark and offensive in the perpetual twilight. The images on the small screen looked different than the physical markings, flattened and less disturbing, as if the camera couldn't quite capture whatever quality made his fingers itch to touch them, and his instincts scream not to. "Rachel?" he called out, his voice absorbed by the forest like water into a sponge. "Rachel Connolly? This is Ranger Thomas Mercer. If you can hear me, call out." Silence. Then, somewhere deeper in the forest where the trail bent toward the river, a sound, not a voice. Something between a breath and a sob, sustained too long to be human but shaped enough like human to make his skin contract. Thomas moved toward it, hand on his radio, thumb ready to call for backup. Except backup was 50 miles away, and by the time anyone reached this location, whatever was happening would have already happened. That was the arithmetic of wilderness rescue. Time and distance reduced every intervention to archaeology, not prevention. The fog was thickening. That wasn't unusual. The Ho generated its own weather systems, moisture condensing and dispersing in cycles that had nothing to do with forecasts. But there was something deliberate about this fog, the way it moved in currents that suggested intention rather than meteorology. It pooled in the low places and reached in tendrils through the trees, and where it touched the moss seemed to darken, to take on tones of gray and black instead of that luminous green. Mile marker 5. The trail forked here, the main path continuing east along the river, a secondary trail, barely maintained, really just a suggestion worn into the earth by decades of boots, climbing north toward an area called Elk Lake. Thomas checked his GPS, but the screen showed only static. He tapped it, reset it, but the device had succumbed to whatever electromagnetic confusion haunted this place. His grandfather's compass worked, though. Pointed north with the steady certainty of iron seeking truth. On a tree at the fork, something hung. Thomas approached slowly, every instinct screaming wrongness. It was hair, long black hair, impossibly long, braided and hung from a low branch in a way that suggested both offering and warning. The hair looked freshly cut, still held moisture, and when Thomas got close enough to see detail, he noticed each strand had been tied with tiny knots at precise intervals, creating a texture like braille or coding. He didn't touch it. His mother's voice, memory now rather than presence. "Some things are doors, Thomas. You touch them, you open something. You open something, you can't always close it again. His radio crackled. Thomas? Thomas? If you're there. Rachel's voice, but different now. Flatter. Like someone reading phonetic sounds without understanding their meaning. I found it. The place where it happened. They're still here, Thomas. They never left. They've been waiting, and now... Rachel, what's your exact location? Thomas demanded, but the radio went dead. Not even static. Just absence of sound so complete it felt like the device had stopped existing. He took the northern fork, following the compass more than memory because the trail kept vanishing under fresh moss that looked decades old. The forest changed here. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to create genuine darkness even though his watch insisted it was only 8:15 a.m. The temperature dropped, not gradually but in zones, pockets of cold that his breath made visible. And the smell changed too. Underneath the usual perfume of decay and growth, something else. Mineral. Sharp. Like ozone. Or like the smell that clung to his mother's hands after she cleaned the family altar. At what his GPS would have called mile 6 if his GPS had been functioning, Thomas found Rachel's backpack. Red and blue, REI brand. Sitting upright in the center of what had once been a trail, but was now just a narrow corridor between walls of vegetation. The pack's contents had been removed and arranged around it in a perfect circle. Water bottle, first aid kit, energy bars still in their wrappers, fleece jacket folded with geometric precision, and in the exact center of this circle, a notebook, open to a page filled with writing that deteriorated from normal cursive at the top to frantic scrawling at the bottom, to something that might have been letters, or might have been attempts to draw what letters couldn't describe. Thomas read the final legible sentences. The fog has faces. I thought they were rocks at first, stones covered in moss, but then they moved. They're children. They're all children, and they're looking at me like I'm supposed to understand something, like I'm supposed to remember. But I don't remember. I wasn't even born yet, but they don't care about that. They don't care about anything except... The handwriting dissolved into illegibility after that, lines crossing and recrossing until the paper tore. Thomas's throat had gone dry. Children. His mother had told him stories, the ones her grandmother told her about Kodomo no Rei. Spirits of children who died far from home, who wandered forever looking for parents who would never come. But those were Japanese ghost stories, and this was Washington State, and the two had no business intersecting except there had been internment camps. Not here, not exactly, but close enough. During World War II, when fear had been weaponized and transformed into policy, when American citizens had been reclassified as enemy aliens and disappeared into detention centers scattered across the remote interior. Thomas knew the history academically, but standing here in this forest that felt increasingly like it existed in some temporal overlap, he wondered what he'd failed to understand about how places remembered violence. A sound behind him. Thomas spun, hand going to the bear spray on his belt, useless against what he was actually afraid of, but the gesture was automatic. The fog had thickened into near solidity, and standing in it, or maybe composed of it, was a shape. Small, child-sized, motionless in a way that nothing living held stillness, because living things betrayed themselves with breath and pulse and the tiny, constant adjustments of balance against gravity. Rachel? Thomas tried, knowing it wasn't, but his voice needed to fill the silence with something recognizable. The shape didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there in the fog, and Thomas realized with a precision that felt like cold water through his veins that he couldn't actually see any features. Where a face should be, there was only suggestion, a blur that his eyes kept trying to resolve into eyes and mouth and nose but couldn't, as if whatever he was looking at existed at a frequency just outside human perception. He took a step backward. The shape mirrored him, maintaining exact distance. Another step. Same result. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no insect hum, no whisper of wind through branches. Just his breathing and the wet sound of his boots in moss and something else. A low sustained note that might have been auditory hallucination, or might have been the forest itself vibrating at the frequency of grief. Thomas turned and ran. Not away from the thing, because there was no away, but toward where the trail should continue, toward where Rachel might still be something more than a name on a missing persons report. The fog moved with him, or maybe he was moving through it without making progress because landmarks that should have appeared didn't, and the compass in his hand spun lazily, pointing nowhere and everywhere. He crashed through undergrowth, moss tearing loose in sheets, his lungs burning with the effort of breathing air that had gone cold enough to hurt. Behind him, beside him, ahead of him, he heard it now. Not footsteps, but presence. Multiple presences, small and patient and full of an emotion that transcended anger into something purer and more terrible. Not revenge, correction. The cosmic kind, the readjustment of accounts that had been deliberately falsified. The trees opened suddenly into a clearing that shouldn't exist. Thomas had memorized the topographical maps, and there was no clearing marked at this location. But here it was anyway, roughly circular, 50 feet across, and in its center a structure. Not quite a building, the remains of one maybe, or a collection of objects arranged to suggest habitation. Wooden posts driven into the ground in a square pattern, rusted metal sheeting, fragments of tar paper, and everywhere, scattered like seeds, objects of daily life rendered archaeological by abandonment. A child's shoe, leather rotted to lace, tin cups, corroded green, shards of mirror glass, and hanging from the wooden posts, dozens of strips of paper covered in writing. Japanese characters that Thomas couldn't read but recognized as prayers, protection sutras, the kind his mother had kept tucked into the corners of door frames. In the center of this ruin, Rachel Connolly stood with her back to him, completely motionless, her arms at her sides, her head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to something inaudible. "Rachel," Thomas said, his voice coming out strangled. "Rachel, we need to leave. Now." She turned, and Thomas's lungs forgot their function. Rachel's face was her own. He could recognize her from the photo on her driver's license that dispatch had sent to his radio. But her expression was nothing he'd seen on a living human. Calm beyond calm, empty beyond empty. And her eyes, pupils dilated so wide there was almost no iris visible, just darkness reflecting darkness. "They want me to remember," she said, her voice that same flat affect from the radio. "But I don't remember, I wasn't there. None of us were there. But they don't understand linear time anymore. They've been waiting too long. Time doesn't work the same for them. We're all guilty, Thomas. Every one of us who walks free while they're still trapped in the moment of dying alone and terrified and confused about what they did wrong. What crime did they commit? Being born with the wrong faces? Speaking the wrong language in their own homes? "Rachel, you're hypothermic," Thomas said, moving toward her slowly, hands visible, using the voice he'd learned in crisis intervention training. "You're confused. We need to get you warm and—" "I'm not confused." Rachel smiled, and the smile was all wrong. Corners pulling too far, duration lasting too long. "I'm seeing clearly for the first time. Do you know what happened here, Thomas? A family. Mother, father, 3 children. They escaped from Minidoka in 1943, tried to disappear into the wilderness, thought they could survive here until the war ended and sanity returned. They lasted 6 weeks before exposure and starvation killed the youngest first, then the others one by one. The mother was last. She scratched prayers into trees, begging ancestors for intervention, for mercy, for understanding of why her children were being punished for nothing. The prayers didn't work. You can't reach across an ocean when you're dying in a forest. You can't make the dead hear you when you're becoming one of them. The fog contracted around the clearing, and Thomas could see them now. Really see them. 5 shapes in the mist, 2 adult-sized, 3 smaller. They didn't move, but they were there. Had been there the entire time. Would be there long after Thomas left or didn't leave, because some presences achieved permanence through the sheer weight of injustice. "They're not haunting the forest," Rachel continued, her voice beginning to crack, emotion bleeding through the eeriness. "They're haunting America, this whole country. Every place where we looked away, where we let fear make us cruel, where we built camps and cages and told ourselves it was necessary, that we were protecting something, when all we were protecting was our own comfort with easy answers. The forest is just where these particular ghosts ended up, but they're connected to all the others. Can you feel it, Thomas? The network of them, the web of abandoned children and broken families stretching back centuries forward into futures we're already building. Thomas's hands were shaking. He recognized the rhetoric: trauma-induced disassociation, psychotic break, any number of clinical terms that explained nothing about the way the air had gone thick with presence, the way he could taste copper and salt, the way every instinct he possessed screamed that Rachel wasn't wrong. She was just speaking truth that reality usually had the decency to keep metaphorical. "I found her," Rachel said quietly, and she stepped aside, and Thomas saw what she'd been blocking from view: a body. Partially mummified by the particular chemistry of the rainforest, preserved enough that features were distinguishable. Asian features, female, young, wearing hiking clothes that would have been current 3 years ago. Sarah Chen, the hiker Thomas had failed to save, the failure that had driven him into this exile, lay curled at the base of a moss-covered post, her hands folded across her chest, positioned with care that suggested purpose. "They kept her," Rachel whispered. "As what? Offering? Companion? Warning? I don't think they know anymore. They've been here so long, Thomas. So long that they've forgotten everything except the feeling, the betrayal, the abandonment, the dying alone. That's all they are now. Just that feeling, concentrated and permanent. And everyone who comes here trying to find peace in nature, trying to pretend the world is beautiful and makes sense, they touch that feeling and..." She stopped, tilted her head again, listening. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, they're showing me. The mother's name was Akiko. The father was Hiroshi. The children were Emi, 7 years old, Kenji, 5, and little Yuki, just 3. Yuki died first. Did you know that 3-year-olds don't understand death? They kept asking when they could go home, kept asking what they did wrong, kept asking why Mama and Papa couldn't fix it. Because parents fix things, that's what parents do. Except Akiko and Hiroshi couldn't fix America, couldn't fix fear, couldn't fix the impossibility of surviving in a forest with no supplies and 3 children, and winter coming." Thomas forced his feet to move, closed the distance between himself and Rachel, grabbed her arm. Her skin was ice cold, temperature dropping below physiologically viable, but she was still talking, still channeling something that was using her voice as instrument. The mother lasted longest, watched all of them die, buried them with her hands, said prayers over each grave, then sat down and waited for her own death like it was an appointment she was late for. She died on December 7th, 1943, second anniversary of Pearl Harbor. She found that ironic. Laughed about it, actually, as she froze. Laughed and laughed until she couldn't breathe anymore. "Rachel, stop talking, look at me." Thomas gripped both her shoulders now, shook her gently, then harder when she didn't respond. "You're going into shock. Whatever you think you're experiencing, it's not real, it's..." Her eyes focused on his face with sudden intensity. "Not real? Thomas, you know better. You've always known better. That's why Sarah's death broke you. Not because you failed to save her, but because you understood exactly what happened to her. And understanding meant accepting that the world contains things that shouldn't exist but do anyway. You felt them watching you when you found her pack. You knew you were being evaluated, measured, judged. They let you leave because your guilt was already sufficient punishment, but now you're back and you brought your guilt with you. And guilt is exactly what they feed on. It's their entire diet. The only thing that sustains them in the long emptiness between dying and whatever comes after." Thomas's radio erupted into static so loud he jerked back. Through the noise, a voice, his own voice, which was impossible because he wasn't speaking. "Failed Sarah Chen, failed everyone, deserved this, deserved to stay here." He ripped the radio from his belt and threw it, watched it land in moss that immediately began growing over it, consuming it, like the forest was accelerating time just for that object, showing him how quickly the world erased everything. "They're offering you a choice," Rachel said, and now she was crying, tears cutting tracks through dirt on her face. "They'll let one of us leave. One. The other stays, joins their collection, becomes part of the testimony. The physical proof that they existed, that their suffering meant something, that someone has to pay attention because someone has to pay. That's the math of injustice, Thomas. Someone always pays, the only question is who." The fog pressed closer. The 5 shapes stood at the clearing's perimeter, arrayed in positions that might have been strategic or might have been ritual. Thomas could see more detail now, too much detail. Clothing that had been carefully repaired, patches on patches until it was more repair than original garment. Faces that were faces but also maps of suffering, every line etched by cold and hunger and fear. The children's faces especially. They looked at him with eyes that had lost the capacity for hope but never lost the capacity for memory. Thomas thought about Sarah Chen, about the moment he'd found her pack and known, absolutely known, that she was already gone. About the way he'd continued searching anyway, because stopping meant accepting, and accepting meant acknowledging that he worked in a forest that sometimes chose to keep what entered it. He thought about his mother, who'd spent her last years insisting he carry protection sutras, who'd told him stories about Kodomo no Rei, and made him promise he'd never laugh at beliefs just because he couldn't see their evidence. He thought about Akiko and Hiroshi and Emi and Kenji and little Yuki, who'd been 3 years old and confused and cold, and had died asking questions that had no answers. He thought about Rachel Connolly, 26 years old, from Oregon, who'd come here looking for beauty and found horror instead, and who didn't deserve this, didn't deserve any of this, deserved to go home and hug whoever loved her and never think about the Ho rainforest again. "No," Thomas said. The word fell into silence like a stone into deep water. "No," he repeated and pulled Rachel toward him, turned them both away from the clearing, from the shapes, from the ruin, and the body, and the weight of grief that had calcified into haunting. "This isn't balance, this isn't justice, it's just more death feeding more death. The answer isn't sacrifice, it's witnessing, it's telling the story. It's making sure Akiko and Hiroshi and Emi and Kenji and Yuki aren't forgotten." The cold intensified. The fog became nearly solid. Thomas heard movement behind them, small feet on moss, multiple sets getting closer. His heart hammered against his ribs. His breath came in gasps. Every animal instinct screamed run, but he didn't run. He kept walking, slowly, deliberately, one arm around Rachel, who had started shaking violently, the other hand reaching into his pack for the oilcloth bundle. He unwrapped his mother's prayer book, opened it to a page he'd memorized without meaning to, and started reading aloud in broken Japanese that was probably more English phonetics than proper pronunciation. But his mother had told him intention mattered more than perfect execution, and his intention was absolutely clear. Not banishment, not dismissal, acknowledgement, testimony, the verbal equivalent of bearing witness. The presences stopped pursuing. Thomas felt rather than saw their hesitation. He kept reading, kept walking, navigating by compass and instinct, because the trail had disappeared, but direction still existed. Rachel stumbled beside him, her breathing ragged, her weight increasing as shock cascaded through her system. "I'll tell it," Thomas said aloud, interrupting his own recitation. "I'll make sure people know, about the camps, about the families who ran, about what happened here, about Akiko and Hiroshi and Emi and Kenji and Yuki. I swear it. I'll tell it until someone listens, until someone acknowledges it, until it becomes part of the record. That's what I can offer. Not my life, not hers, but my voice, our voices. Testimony instead of sacrifice." The fog began to thin, not quickly, not obviously, but gradually, like dawn approaching by increments. The temperature rose 1 degree, then another. Thomas kept walking, kept reading, kept speaking the names aloud. Akiko, Hiroshi, Emi, Kenji, Yuki, like a rosary, like a map, like the only true magic available to the living, which is the refusal to let the dead become entirely dead. They reached the main trail at 2:34 p.m. according to Thomas's watch, though he'd lost all sense of actual duration. Rachel had stopped talking an hour ago, had started talking again 30 minutes ago, cycling through lucidity and disassociation. Thomas's radio worked suddenly, crackling to life with dispatch demanding his location and status. He reported, his voice mechanical, already preparing the lie he'd have to tell because the truth would end his career and help no one. The hospital in Forks kept Rachel for 3 days. Severe hypothermia, dehydration, possible psychotic episode induced by exposure and stress. She didn't contradict the diagnosis. When Thomas visited her the day before her discharge, she looked at him with eyes that were entirely present but fundamentally changed. "I still hear them sometimes," she said quietly. "Not voices, just presence, like they're checking in, making sure I remember." "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. "Knowing?" Rachel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said finally. "Not knowing would be worse. That's the real horror, isn't it? Not the ghosts themselves, but a world where their suffering doesn't even register, where we build our peace on top of their graves and never ask what's underneath." Thomas nodded. He'd already started researching, compiling information about the internment camps, about escape attempts, about families who'd vanished into wilderness rather than submit to incarceration. The work felt necessary in a way his job never had, like he'd finally found the thing he was supposed to be doing with the small collection of days he'd been granted. Sarah Chen's remains were recovered and returned to her family. The official report attributed her death to exposure and disorientation, which was true enough. What the report didn't mention was how they'd found her, positioned with care that suggested intention rather than accident. Thomas included that detail in his personal notes, the archive he was building, the testimony he'd promised to deliver. He still worked in Olympic National Park, still patrolled the Ho River Trail, but he approached it differently now, with the awareness that certain places existed in multiple registers simultaneously. Beautiful and deadly, preserved and haunted, natural and constructed by layers of human choice and consequence. The tourists who visited saw majesty and peace. Thomas saw something more complex. A forest growing over a graveyard, growing over a crime scene, growing over a country's inability to reckon with its own capacity for cruelty. On quiet days, when the fog rolled in thick and the forest held that particular quality of silence that suggested attention, Thomas would stop at what he'd marked on his personal maps as the clearing, though officially it didn't exist. He'd speak the names aloud: Akiko, Hiroshi, Emi, Kenji, Yuki, and sometimes he'd feel that peculiar cold, that sense of presence, and he'd continue speaking, telling them what he'd learned, what he'd documented, what small progress he'd made toward making their suffering visible. Whether they heard him, whether it mattered, whether the dead could find any peace in the testimony of the living, these were questions without provable answers. But Thomas had learned that some things had to be done regardless of evidence or outcome. Some debts had to be acknowledged even if they could never be repaid. Some stories had to be told even if they made listeners uncomfortable, especially if they made listeners uncomfortable because comfort was the luxury that had enabled the original injustice. The forest kept its secrets, but Thomas kept his promise. That seemed, in the end, like the only mathematics that balanced. Not erasure, but memory. Not forgetting, but the deliberate, difficult work of carrying the past forward into whatever future could be built from the rubble of what came before. And on December 7th each year, Thomas returned to that clearing that officially didn't exist, and he sat in the cold, and he said the names, and he bore witness to ghosts who were still there, not because they chose haunting, but because no one had ever given them permission to rest. He sat until dark, until the cold became dangerous, and sometimes he thought he felt something. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't available, but maybe acknowledgement. A sense that his presence mattered, that the simple act of showing up, of remembering, of refusing to look away constituted its own form of justice. Not enough justice, never enough, but something. A small light against a darkness that stretched backward through history and forward into futures that hadn't yet decided what kind of country they wanted to become. Thomas tended that light with the dedication of someone who'd learned the hard way that the alternative was becoming another person who walked through beauty and never asked what made it possible. never questioned what lay underneath, never heard the voices calling from the places where the moss grew thick enough to swallow everything except memory. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Sarah Chen and the Tanaka family. The voicemail arrived at 11:47 p.m. on February 3, 2011. While David Harrison was reviewing incident reports in the cramped ranger station office at Superior National Forest's Echo Bay Outpost. His daughter's name glowed on his Motorola flip phone screen, and he felt that familiar twinge of paternal concern. Sarah knew better than to call this late unless something was wrong. He flipped the phone open. One voicemail. His thumb hesitated over the button. Dave had been a ranger for 23 years. The last 15 in this remote corner of northeastern Minnesota, where the Boundary Waters wilderness kissed the Canadian border. He knew the difference between routine and emergency, between concern and catastrophe. Something in his gut, that same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 decades of wilderness work, whispered that this message would divide his life into before and after. He pressed play. Static crackled first, then Sarah's voice emerged, thin and distorted by poor reception. Dad, if you get this. A sharp breath, almost a sob. I'm somewhere off the Tomahawk Trail, I think. Maybe 8-9 miles past the Caribou Lake Junction. Everything looks the same now. It's so fucking cold, Dad. Colder than it should be. Dave's hand tightened around the phone. Sarah was supposed to be winter camping with 2 friends from the University of Minnesota, Duluth. A carefully planned trip he'd approved only after she'd shown him their route plan, their gear list, their emergency protocols. Tomahawk Trail. That was deep country, old country, where the forest grew dense enough to swallow GPS signals, and the nearest fire road was 12 miles away. There's something wrong with Alyssa. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and Dave found himself leaning closer to the phone's tiny speaker. She won't stop eating. We gave her 3 protein bars an hour ago, and she ate them without even unwrapping them, Dad, wrapper and all. And she's saying things in some language I don't recognize, and her eyes... A sound interrupted her. Not quite wind, not quite breathing. Something between hunger and speech, if speech could be a physical thing that moved through air like cold water. Oh God, she's coming back. Dad, I'm hiding my pack by a big lightning-struck pine with a triple trunk. Coordinates on my Garmin are North 48. The sound came again, closer. In the background, impossibly clear despite the static, Dave heard footsteps crunching through snow. But the rhythm was wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause. Like something learning to walk on legs not quite its own. Please. Sarah's voice cracked. Please find me before... The message ended abruptly, cut off mid-breath. Dave stood frozen in the amber light of the station, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to dead air. Outside, February wind rattled the windows with a sound like fingernails on glass. The regulator clock above the door ticked into the silence. 11:49 p.m. The temperature display on his weather station read -18 Fahrenheit, -37 with wind chill. His training said to call it in. Protocol dictated notification to the incident commander, assembly of a proper search and rescue team, coordination with Lake County Sheriff's Department. At least 6 hours before they could even begin staging personnel, longer before dawn made aerial reconnaissance viable. His training also said that exposure death occurred in 3 to 6 hours at these temperatures. Dave's hand moved to the radio mounted on his belt, then stopped. He thought of the sound in the background of Sarah's message, that wrong rhythm walking. He thought of her friend eating plastic and foil, speaking in unknown tongues. He thought of the old stories the Ojibwe elders sometimes shared at ranger meetings. Stories they told with uncomfortable seriousness about the deep woods beyond Caribou Lake, about winters when the cold came from somewhere older than weather. Stories about hunger that could never be satisfied. His hand moved to the equipment locker instead. At midnight, Dave's Ford F-350 with the National Park Service logo on the door rumbled out of the Echo Bay station, unauthorized, against every regulation he'd followed for 2 decades. The bed was packed with 72 hours of winter survival gear, his personal equipment maintained to standards that exceeded NPS requirements. MSR tent, North Face sleeping bag rated to -40, Jetboil stove, 5 days of freeze-dried rations, emergency beacon, first aid kit heavy enough to treat major trauma, climbing rope, ice axe, the Remington 870 shotgun he kept for deterring aggressive black bears, loaded with slugs heavy enough to stop a moose. The last item, technically against regulations for routine patrol, felt necessary in a way he couldn't articulate. The Garmin GPS unit suctioned to his dashboard showed the route in glowing blue lines. Highway 61 north to Forest Road 165, then 23 miles of increasingly primitive road to the Tomahawk trailhead. 2 hours in good conditions. Tonight, with black ice hidden under fresh powder and visibility reduced to the tunnel of his headlights, maybe 3. Dave drove with the methodical focus of a man performing a familiar task while something screams underneath. His daughter's voice played on loop in his mind. "It's so fucking cold, Dad." Colder than it should be. The temperature outside was brutal, but predictable for northern Minnesota in February. So what had she meant? The highway unrolled empty and black beneath his tires. Occasionally, yellow eyes flashed from the roadside. White-tailed deer, moving nervously through the darkness. More than usual, as if something had disturbed their nocturnal patterns, pushed them toward human spaces despite their instincts. Forest Road 165 turned out to be a nightmare of unplowed snow and fallen branches. Dave engaged 4-wheel drive and dropped to 15 miles per hour, the truck lurching and sliding through drifts that came up to the wheel wells. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel that ate his headlights' reach. The GPS showed his progress as an agonizingly slow blue dot creeping across the screen. At 2:34 a.m., 12 miles from the trailhead, the road became impassable. A massive birch had fallen across both lanes, its trunk thick as a barrel, its naked branches spreading like broken fingers. Recent fall. The wood was fresh, the snow around it still settling. Dave killed the engine. In the sudden silence, he heard only wind and the ticking of cooling metal. He checked the GPS. 4.3 miles to the trailhead. From there, another 8 to 9 miles to wherever Sarah had called from. 12 miles total through wilderness in darkness and cold that could kill in hours. His rational mind, the part trained in risk assessment and safety protocols, said to wait for dawn for backup, for conditions to improve. His paternal mind, raw and desperate, said his daughter was dying while he sat in a warm truck calculating odds. He thought again of the sound in Sarah's voicemail. That shuffling, learning to walk rhythm. She's coming back. Dave grabbed his pack, chambered around into the Remington, and started walking. The forest in deep winter becomes a place outside of normal experience. During day, it's merely hostile, a test of preparation and will. At night, especially night this cold, it transforms into something older. The darkness between the trees isn't empty, it has weight and presence. The cold isn't just absence of heat. It's a force that presses through every layer of fabric, that finds every gap and seam, that reminds mammalian bodies their temporarily animated meat slowly returning to the temperature of stone. Dave moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent decades in wilderness. His headlamp carved a white cone through the darkness, and he kept his breathing controlled, his pace steady. His watch showed -21 Fahrenheit. His breath froze into ice crystals in his beard. The trailhead parking lot appeared after an hour, a small clearing with a wooden kiosk holding faded maps and warning signs. 2 vehicles sat buried under snow, a Subaru Outback and a Jeep Cherokee, both with University of Minnesota Duluth parking stickers. Sarah's Subaru. Dave's chest tightened as he approached it, but he forced himself to check methodically. Locked. No signs of disturbance. Registration and insurance cards visible on the dash. Everything suggesting an ordinary camping trip that expected to return. The Tomahawk Trail began as a clear path marked by orange blazes on tree trunks. Dave followed it northeast, deeper into the forest, his headlamp sweeping across snow that lay undisturbed except for deer tracks and the occasional bounding trail of a snowshoe hare. No human prints. If Sarah and her friends had come this way days ago, the snow had covered their passage completely. After an hour on the trail, Dave's internal temperature regulation began its losing battle with the cold. Despite his layers, merino wool base, fleece mid, Gore-Tex shell, the cold found ways in. His fingers and toes reported increasing numbness. He stopped to check his extremities, flexing and wiggling to maintain circulation, then continued. The forest changed as he moved deeper. The trees grew larger, older. White pine and red pine that predated European settlement, that had been ancient when voyageurs first paddled these waterways. Their trunks rose like pillars into darkness beyond his headlamp's reach. The underbrush thinned, leaving clear sight lines between the trees that somehow made the darkness more oppressive rather than less. At 5:17 a.m., Dave's headlamp beam caught something wrong. A deer carcass lay 20 feet off the trail, partially buried in snow. Nothing unusual about that. Deer died in winter, predators fed. But as Dave moved closer, his light revealed details that didn't fit natural patterns. The deer had been opened, not torn apart by wolves or bears, but surgically dismantled, as if something had been searching for specific parts. The ribs spread like a grotesque flower. Most of the meat remained, frozen and untouched. Only certain organs were missing: heart, liver, stomach, the parts that processed hunger. Dave's hand tightened on the Remington. He scanned the surrounding darkness, but his light showed only trees and snow and the endless, indifferent forest. He marked the location on his GPS and continued, moving faster now, driven by growing unease that transcended rational fear. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if the sun resented illuminating this place. Gray light filtered through the canopy, bringing no warmth, only enough visibility to see that Dave was entering older forest still. Trees here stood so thick and tall they blocked most of the snow, leaving a carpet of brown needles interspersed with patches of ice. The trail markers became less frequent, sometimes missing entirely, and Dave found himself navigating by compass and GPS. His Garmin showed he'd covered 7.2 miles from the trailhead, somewhere close. Somewhere in this cathedral of ancient trees, his daughter was hiding or running or already frozen. He checked his phone. No signal, as expected. He'd try Sarah's number anyway every few minutes, hope against topology and physics that somehow a message would get through. The cold intensified as he moved deeper, which shouldn't have been possible. Wind chill couldn't explain it. This cold had a quality beyond temperature. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, from the trees, from the air between the trees. Dave's breath came in gasps now, each inhalation like swallowing razor blades, each exhalation a cloud of white that lingered unnaturally long before dispersing. At 7:43 a.m., he heard the sound. Footsteps, crunching through snow and frozen detritus, coming from his left maybe 50 yards away, moving parallel to his position. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. Dave stopped breathing. He brought the Remington up, thumbed off the safety with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. His headlamp had long since been switched off in the growing daylight, but now he wished for darkness again, for the comfort of limited visibility. Because he could see the trees where the footsteps moved, could see the shadows between them, could almost... A figure stepped into view. It wore what had once been winter camping gear, a purple North Face jacket, black snow pants, boots, but the clothing hung wrong, as if the body inside had changed shape, grown longer in some places and shorter in others. The figure moved with that same 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythm, learning coordination, adapting to limbs that no longer quite fit. It turned toward Dave. The face remained mostly human. That was almost worse than if it had been monstrous, because Dave recognized the girl, Alyssa Chen, who'd been in his living room 2 weeks ago, who'd laughed at his dad jokes, who'd promised to keep Sarah safe. Her eyes had gone milky white, but beneath the film, movement suggested she could still see. Her mouth hung open, jaw distended wider than anatomy should allow. And from that mouth came a sound, half breathing, half speaking, words in Ojibwe that Dave's brain somehow understood despite never having studied the language. Hungry. So hungry, never enough. Join us. Join the hunger. Alyssa's head tilted at an angle beyond human capability, and she smiled with too many teeth. Dave's finger found the trigger, but he couldn't make himself pull it. This was a college student, 19 years old, Sarah's friend. Maybe hypothermic, maybe experiencing some kind of mental break, maybe treatable if he could just... Alyssa lunged with impossible speed. Dave fired on instinct, the shotgun's roar obliterating the forest's silence. The slug caught Alyssa's center mass, should have dropped her, should have done what high-velocity lead does to flesh and bone. She stumbled but didn't fall. The impact made her hesitate, made her look down at the hole in her jacket where down feathers spilled out mixed with something darker. Then she raised her eyes to Dave and she laughed, a sound like ice cracking under weight. Dave chambered another round, fired again, and again, each shot precise, each one hitting center mass or head, the kind of shooting that came from decades of practice and desperation. Alyssa jerked with each impact but kept coming, kept moving in that wrong rhythm, kept reaching with fingers that had grown too long and ended in nails that looked more like claws. On the fifth shot, Dave's heel caught on a hidden root. He went down hard on his back, the impact driving air from his lungs, the Remington spinning from his grip to land 3 feet away in the snow. Alyssa was on him instantly, straddling his chest, her weight impossibly heavy. Up close, Dave could see that her eyes weren't just milky. They were frozen. Ice crystals growing in organic structures never meant to freeze. Her breath came out in a visible cloud of white that smelled like old meat and something worse, something chemical and ancient. Her mouth opened wider, wider, jaw unhinging like a snake's. Inside, her throat had changed. It went down and down, a tunnel lined with new growths that looked like teeth or ice or both. Makwa nitam, kichi makwa. The words came from deep in that impossible throat. You'll join. Everyone joins. The hunger takes everyone eventually. Dave's hand scrabbled in the snow, found the ice axe clipped to his pack. With the last of his strength, he swung it up and buried the pick in Alyssa's temple. She went still. For one moment, she looked almost human again, confused, frightened, young. Then she collapsed sideways into the snow, and Dave saw that instead of blood, something crystalline and white leaked from the wound, steaming in the cold air. He lay gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every breath hurt. His body was crashing from adrenaline, from cold, from the impossibility of what had just happened. She ate them without even unwrapping them, wrapper and all. It's so fucking cold, Dad. Colder than it should be. The Ojibwe stories. The ones the elders told with uncomfortable seriousness. Wendigo, Wendigo, Wetiko. Different spellings for the same legend. A spirit born of hunger and cold. A cannibal entity that consumed humans and wore their skins that spread like contagion, turning its victims into new iterations of endless appetite. Just a legend. Just a myth to explain winter starvation and hypothermia-induced madness in indigenous communities before modern medicine. Except... Dave forced himself to his feet, retrieved the Remington, reloaded with shaking hands. He looked at Alyssa's body, already partially buried in snow that was falling heavier now despite the clear sky he'd seen 30 minutes ago. Local weather. Impossible weather. The kind that appeared around supernatural cold. He checked his GPS. Sarah's coordinates put her less than a mile away, northeast, somewhere near the old Caribou Lake region where, according to those same Ojibwe stories, a winter camp had disappeared in 1878. Every person gone, only frozen tracks and strange markings left behind. Dave started moving faster now, abandoning caution for speed. The cold intensified with each step, and with it came the hunger. Not his own natural hunger, though he'd eaten nothing since yesterday. This was something else, a gnawing emptiness in his stomach that felt almost sentient, that whispered suggestions about the deer carcass he'd passed, about the protein in frozen flesh, about consumption as the only way to fill the void. He found the lightning-struck pine at 8:31 a.m. The tree stood exactly as Sarah had described, massive, ancient, Its trunk split into 3 sections by some long-ago strike that had charred the wood black, and at its base, partially buried in snow, he found the orange backpack with University of Minnesota Duluth patches sewn on its sides. "Sarah!" His shout echoed through the forest, came back distorted. "Sarah, it's Dad!" Movement to his right. Dave spun. Remington raised. Sarah stepped out from behind a cluster of young birch, and relief flooded through Dave with such force it nearly dropped him. She was alive. She was mobile. She was wrong. His daughter moved with that same rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause. Her blue parka hung open despite the cold, exposing the thermal shirt beneath. Her face was pale, lips blue, but her eyes were beginning to film over with that crystalline white. "Dad." Her voice sounded distant, echoey, as if traveling from somewhere deep. "You came. I knew you would." "I'm so hungry, Dad. I haven't eaten in 2 days and I'm so hungry it hurts. It burns. It's all I can think about." Dave lowered the shotgun, couldn't bear to aim it at his daughter. "Sarah, baby, we need to get you warm. Get you to a hospital. You're hypothermic. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly." Sarah took a step closer. Clearer than ever. "I understand now. The cold helps. The cold makes everything sharp. And when you're this hungry, when the hunger fills every part of you, everything becomes simple. There's only finding food. Only feeding." "Sarah, did you see Alyssa?" Another step. She was the first. She ate a handful of trail mix and then couldn't stop. She said she could feel something inside her, growing, spreading. She tried to fight it. She really did. But the hunger always wins, Dad. Always. Dave's hand tightened on the Remington. This wasn't his daughter. Wasn't Sarah. This was something wearing her body, speaking with her voice, using his love as a weapon. But he'd seen her eyes. In that brief moment he'd seen her, the real Sarah, trapped behind the hunger, terrified, pleading. She was still in there. "I can help you." His voice cracked. "Whatever this is, we'll find help. There are doctors, specialists. There's only one help." Sarah lunged. Dave jerked the shotgun up but couldn't fire, couldn't destroy his daughter's body, even to save himself. Sarah's hands closed on the barrel, and her strength was enormous, inhuman. She ripped the weapon from his grip and threw it 30 feet into a snowbank. Then she was on him, bearing him down into the snow, her weight and the cold and the hunger pressing down like the earth itself was claiming him. Her fingers, God, her fingers had grown long and sharp, tore at his jacket, searching for flesh. "I'm sorry, Dad, I love you. I tried to fight it, but it's easier if you just let go. Let go and join the hunger." Dave's hand found the ice axe again, but this time, he couldn't make himself swing it. Couldn't plant it in his daughter's skull no matter what she'd become. So instead, he swung it past her, buried the pick in the frozen ground, and used it as leverage to roll them both. Sarah, caught off balance by her new body's unfamiliar proportions, tumbled sideways. Dave scrambled to his feet, started running. He had no plan, no destination, just animal instinct screaming to flee from a predator. The forest blurred past, trees and snow and cold and the sound of Sarah pursuing, her footsteps matching that horrible 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythm. Dave's lungs burned, his muscles screamed. The hunger inside him grew stronger, whispering that if he stopped, if he turned, if he fed, the pain would end. He burst into a clearing and stopped so suddenly he nearly fell. Before him stood a structure, ancient, pre-modern, built from logs and bark in a style he'd seen only in historical photographs. An Ojibwe wigwam, its entrance facing east, its frame still solid despite what must be over a century of weathering. And around it, bodies, dozens of them, frozen in various poses of flight or feast, preserved by the supernatural cold. Some wore buckskin and furs from the 1800s. Others had on clothing from the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s. The most recent, Dave's stomach lurched, wore modern winter gear from the last decade. All of them had that same crystalline white film over their eyes. All of them had mouths opened in eternal hunger. This was where it lived, where it fed, where it turned its victims into new versions of itself, spreading across centuries, waiting for winter to bring it prey. Sarah emerged from the tree line behind him, but she wasn't alone. Alyssa was with her, still moving despite the holes Dave had put in her. And others, so many others, figures in various states of transformation, all moving with that learning to walk rhythm, all radiating cold that had nothing to do with February weather. They formed a circle around Dave and the ancient wigwam, closing in, inevitable. Dave's hand went to his belt, found the emergency beacon. He activated it, knowing rescue was hours away at best, knowing he'd be dead or worse before help arrived. But maybe they'd find evidence. Maybe they'd understand what happened here. Maybe they'd burn this whole cursed stretch of forest and end the cycle. Sarah moved closer, her face a mask of hunger and desperate love fighting for control. Please, Dad, please just give in. It hurts to fight it. Join us and it'll stop hurting. Dave looked at his daughter, at what remained of his daughter, and made a choice that had no good options. He pulled out his jet boil stove, his white gas fuel canister, his waterproof matches. Working with shaking hands, he doused the ancient wigwam with fuel, threw the canister inside, struck a match. The structure went up like it had been waiting centuries to burn. Flames roared upward, bright orange against the white snow and gray sky, producing heat that felt almost violent after so much cold. The figures shrieked. The sound came from all of them at once, a chorus of hunger and rage, and something almost like relief. They scattered backward from the flames, their frozen eyes reflecting fire, their bodies moving in all directions except toward the heat. Sarah stopped 10 feet away. For a moment, one precious moment, her eyes cleared. The film receded. She looked at her father with recognition and horror and love. "Dad," she whispered. "Thank you. Please don't let me." Then the hunger claimed her again, and she turned and fled into the forest with the others, all of them retreating from the fire, from the heat, from the only thing that could stop them. Dave stood alone in the burning clearing, smoke rising to mix with falling snow, and waited for rescue he might not survive to see. The search team found him 4 hours later, hypothermic and delirious, rambling about hunger and cold and his daughter. They found the burned structure, the frozen bodies in various states of decay, the evidence of violence scattered through the forest. They found Alyssa Chen's body with shotgun wounds and an ice axe buried in her skull. They never found Sarah Harrison, or 3 other missing campers from the past 5 years. The official reports listed them as lost to exposure, though the search area was expanded to over 100 square miles and continued through spring thaw. Dave spent 2 weeks in the hospital, lost 3 toes to frostbite, and retired from the Park Service. He moved to Minneapolis, to the city, to lights and warmth in places where winter cold was inconvenient rather than supernatural. But on February nights when the temperature drops and the wind comes from the north, he sometimes hears it. That rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause. Footsteps learning to walk on legs not quite their own, and he feels the hunger, gnawing and endless, whispering that eventually everyone joins. His daughter is still out there, somewhere in the deep forest beyond Caribou Lake, still moving through the trees, still hungry, still waiting for the next winter to bring her prey. And Dave knows with absolute certainty that one winter he'll go back. The pull is too strong, the hunger too deep. Maybe to find her, maybe to end this, maybe just to stop fighting, and finally let the cold win. Some hungers can never be satisfied, some cold never ends, and some stories don't have survivors, only different kinds of victims.